She cooked for Stalin. She was never meant to hear anything. But one night, she did. And what she wrote down changes everything. They told her she'd be invisible. That's why they chose her. A quiet girl with a spotless record, no family ties, no political opinions, at least none she ever voiced. Her name was Anya Morozova, and she had no idea that accepting a government cooking assignment in late 1942 would mean walking into the center of the most paranoid regime on Earth. At just 23, Anya was escorted, without explanation, to a compound deep in the Kuntsevo forest. No signs, no maps, just checkpoints, silence, and cold steel doors. Inside, the walls didn't echo. They absorbed. The men who moved through them spoke in numbers, never names. But she would learn one name very quickly. They whispered it. They feared it. And every plate she prepared was for him. Joseph Stalin. She wasn't supposed to look at him. She wasn't supposed to listen. But she did. And over the years, she began to notice the gaps. What wasn't said, who stopped showing up, and the way even the flowers on the table changed after certain meetings. At first, it was just instinct. Then, it became fear. But there was one night when everything she thought she knew collapsed under the weight of something she was never meant to hear. Decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, her daughter turned over a stack of faded notebooks to a researcher in Moscow. Inside, kitchen routines, supply lists, and buried between the margins, fragments of something darker. Something whispered behind a wall of steam and clinking dishes. One entry stood out, dated just 3 months before Stalin's death. It was one line, faint pencil, smudged by time. He thinks they're trying to kill him, even the doctors, especially the Jews. See, but before we get to that night, the night her world shifted forever, you need to understand where she was, who she was working for, and why her silence was the only thing that kept her alive. Because what she heard that evening would ignite one of the most terrifying purges of the 20th century. And the worst part? No one believed her. At least, not until it was far too late. If you care about the hidden truths behind history's most feared leaders, watch this until the end. What she heard was never meant to be known. They didn't ask her if she wanted to go. No one did. One morning, a black car appeared outside her village bakery, and 2 men in plain coats stepped inside, holding a single envelope. Her name was printed in red ink. They said it was a promotion, a special honor. She wouldn't be baking for local officers anymore. She had been selected for state service, but they didn't say where. Anya Morozova had never seen Moscow before. When she arrived, she wasn't taken to a hotel or government office. She was blindfolded and brought to a basement under the NKVD headquarters, where she was questioned for 7 hours, not about her cooking, but about her neighbors, her loyalties, her silence. They asked about her father, dead since 1935. They asked if she ever prayed, and if she believed food could be poisoned without taste. She answered what they wanted to hear. Or maybe they already knew how she'd respond. Because by nightfall, she was sitting in the back of another car, this time headed beyond the city, into a forest with no name on any map. They called it Blizhnaya Dacha. To outsiders, it was just a cluster of government buildings behind pine trees. But inside, it was something else entirely. A place where silence lived in the walls, and where every fork, every napkin, every step was accounted for. There were no clocks in the kitchen, only bells. 1 bell meant delivery. 2 meant Stalin was awake. 3 meant he was hungry. That first week, she didn't see him. Just his instructions, written in careful cursive, signed only IVS. But even without seeing his face, she felt him. His presence lingered in the spaces he had just left. Rooms suddenly too quiet, guards suddenly too still. Everyone whispered when they spoke of him, even when he wasn't near. And yet, the fear that hung over that place didn't come from the man himself. It came from what he could do, and from what people assumed he might do, even if he didn't say a word. That's how power worked here, not through orders, but through the constant dread of unsaid expectations. Anya's job was simple: boil water, prepare dishes exactly as listed, never change a thing. And under no circumstance should she ever taste the food. No one did. Every ingredient passed through inspection. Some vegetables arrived sealed in wax. Milk was tested with chemicals. The meat came in double-wrapped, handled only with gloves. She didn't ask why, but she knew. Stalin believed everyone was trying to poison him. Everyone. Ministers, generals, even his daughter Svetlana once saw her food thrown away without a bite. At first, Anya thought it was just extreme caution. But then, she saw something she never forgot. One morning, a delivery of cheese arrived, one Stalin had requested personally. That afternoon, the delivery officer was taken away in handcuffs. No explanation. The next day, the same cheese appeared on Stalin's table, untouched. 2 days later, the cheese was gone, and so was the guard who had opened the package. From that moment, she understood something terrifying. Stalin didn't need evidence to punish someone, just suspicion. And this constant terror of invisible threats, wasn't limited to food. But I'll come back to that, because what happened later in that dacha had less to do with what she cooked, and more with what she heard. Something whispered behind closed doors, something that would later become known as the doctor's plot. But when Anya first heard it, there was no name for it. Just a sentence, a pattern, and a silence that suddenly became heavier than anything she'd ever carried. Stalin didn't eat meals, he conducted them. There was no such thing as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Not in the way ordinary people understood. Every dish was a statement. Every cup of tea, a controlled performance. For Anya, the kitchen became less of a workplace and more of a stage, where a wrong movement could lead to disappearance. The routine never changed. Meals arrived on a silver cart, never carried by hand. Plates were handled with gloves. Dishes were identical. No one could tell which one was for Stalin and which were decoys. The food taster, always a man in military gray, sampled each dish exactly 9 minutes before service. If he lived past the first 10, the meal was cleared. Anya was told this process had been repeated since 1936, after the mysterious death of Marshal Tukhachevsky, one of Stalin's own commanders. The official record said heart failure. Anya had heard otherwise. She never once saw Stalin eat with others in her early months. He dined alone, in a quiet study with double doors and blackout curtains. Every time she entered to deliver the tray, she was instructed to lower her eyes. But sometimes, just sometimes, she would catch a glimpse of him in reflection. A man hunched over paperwork, his tea untouched, his lips moving, but no sound coming out. What she noticed more than anything was his relationship with silence. He didn't just demand it, he engineered it. Guards who laughed too loudly were replaced. A maid who sneezed during a corridor shift vanished the next day. Even the birds near the compound had been relocated, or so she was told. But the most unsettling ritual of all was the tea. Every evening, chamomile. Always the same cup, the same saucer. Anya would prepare it precisely. Water heated to the same temperature, brewed for the same number of minutes. She knew the routine down to the second. One night, Stalin didn't touch the tea. He simply stared at it. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. No words, no movement. When Anya returned to collect the tray, she noticed something strange. The cup was still full, but the spoon was bent clean in half. The following day, his bodyguard was reassigned to Murmansk. The day after, Beria arrived in silence, face pale, eyes restless. Something had shifted. Anya didn't know what, but she felt it. The air in the dacha had changed. Stalin didn't speak for 3 days. And when he finally did, it was to order the immediate dismissal of a senior military doctor. No reason given. That was the moment Anya began to understand. The danger wasn't just in Stalin's decisions, it was in his moods. His rituals weren't habits, they were defense mechanisms. And if even the tea had become part of his armor, then nothing, no one, could be considered safe. She wrote later in her notebook, "When the man fears food, it is no longer the body he's protecting. It's the myth." But the illusion of control was cracking. Stalin's body was aging, his paranoia was sharpening, and the people closest to him began to disappear more quickly. Still, no one said a word, except for one evening, one meeting, one whispered phrase behind a locked door that made Anya pause and listen. But we'll come back to that, because first, there were the napkins, and what she began to notice written in their folds. At first, she thought nothing of them. Just plain cloth napkins, always folded into the same tight triangle, always placed at the exact top left corner of Stalin's dining tray. She assumed it was habit, perhaps superstition, but one morning, after a long night meeting with 3 senior generals, she noticed something that unsettled her more than any shattered teacup or missing name on the staff list. The napkin wasn't where it should have been. Instead, it sat crumpled on the edge of the cart, like it had been folded and then crushed by a single fist. When she opened it, something shimmered faintly on the fabric, like water stains, but not quite. Invisible ink was rumored among the staff, but no one ever said it out loud. Saying it out loud meant believing someone was writing secrets not on paper, but on cloth. And yet, the very next day, another napkin appeared. This one neatly folded, face down. It was collected not by a cleaner, but by a silent officer in black gloves. He didn't speak to Anya. He didn't look at her. He took the napkin and burned it in the kitchen's side furnace. From then on, Anya began to track them. Each time Stalin met with someone late into the evening, the next morning there would be a folded napkin, sometimes 2. She noticed a pattern. The more tense the meeting, the more precise the fold. The tighter the triangle, the more severe the aftermath. Once, after a visit from Malenkov and Khrushchev, the napkin was folded so sharply it looked cut with a blade. 2 weeks later, 3 regional commanders were arrested. Their families vanished within days. Anya didn't pretend to understand everything, but she understood enough to be afraid. She began writing notes of her own, not of what was said, but of what was folded. She sketched the napkins, tracked the visits, noted who arrived and who never returned. And in the middle of it all, she began to suspect that Stalin didn't just use the napkins for secrecy. He used them as signals, orders perhaps, or warnings. Later, long after his death, Western researchers would uncover Soviet documents describing the use of chemically treated linens, coated with potassium iodide and copper sulfate, to transmit sensitive messages readable only under ultraviolet light. These were experimental, often unreliable. But within Stalin's inner circle, even unreliable methods were preferable to written words that could be copied or misplaced. Anya didn't have access to ultraviolet lamps. She had only her eyes, her instincts, and a growing sense that the quiet fabric on Stalin's table carried more weight than most speeches. But it wasn't until early 1953 that she realized the napkins were only part of the message. The real warning came in a single sentence, spoken late at night, through a vent, when Stalin thought no one was listening. And Anya, for the first time in years, made the mistake of not looking away. It was late. The kind of late that made the snow outside look like ash. Inside the kitchen, only the low hiss of the samovar kept her company. The others had gone. Stalin's supper had already been delivered. All that remained was to tidy the space before dawn. She didn't expect to hear anything. She never did. Not through those thick walls. But that night, the corridor outside the private study stayed lit longer than usual. Guards shifted nervously. Coats were exchanged. And then, 4 voices moved into the room across from the service pantry. Calm at first, then sharper. She hadn't planned to eavesdrop, but the heating vent above the stove had shifted slightly during the week, leaving a faint gap into the study beyond. She noticed it only by chance. And curiosity, in a place like this, was never safe. But neither was silence anymore. She stepped onto a chair, careful, barely breathing. Through the thin metal slats, the words came fractured, low, fast, sometimes muffled by the clink of a glass or a cough. But then one voice rose, clear, firm, familiar. Stalin's. "He suspects everyone," the voice said. "Even the doctors. Especially the Jews." Everything stopped. Not just in the room, but inside her. She froze, hand gripping the vent frame, the metal cold and sharp beneath her fingertips. For a few seconds, there was only silence again. And then voices layered back in, concerned, confused, trying to recalibrate what had just been said. One man objected, carefully. Another tried to change the subject, but Stalin cut him off. "They're preparing to kill me," he said, slowly, inside out. "I see it." The conversation devolved into a mix of affirmation and fear. No one contradicted him again. There was no need. They knew what this meant. Stalin's fear wasn't idle. It was law. If he believed the doctors were plotting against him, especially Jewish doctors, it wouldn't stay a suspicion for long. That night, Anya didn't sleep. She sat at the edge of her cot, shoes still on, coat folded in her lap, as if ready to flee. But there was nowhere to go. 2 weeks later, she would read a headline posted in the staff corridor. "Doctors conspire to assassinate Soviet leaders. Plot foiled." Photos of respected physicians appeared below, labeled enemies. She recognized some. One had treated her flu a year earlier. Another had delivered the grandson of a friend in a Moscow hospital. All gone. She never told anyone what she had heard. Not then. Not for decades. But she recorded it in her journal, in careful lines, each word etched slowly, like carving into stone. And beneath that entry, she wrote something she never dared say aloud. He was rotting from within. And so, he began to rot the world around him. But her story didn't end there, because just weeks after that night, Stalin would collapse, and Anya would be asked to prepare the final meal he never ate. It was early March. The snow had not yet melted, but the dacha smelled faintly of thaw. Wet stone, damp wood, metal returning to life. Stalin had been quiet for days. No meetings, no visitors. Just the sound of the fire crackling in his private quarters and the occasional shuffle of slippers along the corridor. The staff whispered that he was tired. Others said he was watching everything more closely than ever. Then the order came. A tray, evening service, simple meal, boiled potatoes, pickled vegetables, a slice of cold meat, and chamomile tea, always the tea. Anya prepared it herself. She didn't trust anyone else. Every ingredient had been tested, every plate scrubbed twice. The food taster, now just a boy no older than 20, sampled the meal in silence, nodding once when cleared. The tray was placed outside Stalin's door at precisely 9:15 p.m. It was never picked up. The next morning, the tea was still warm, but no one had heard from him. No movement, no requests. 2 guards knocked. No answer. By mid-morning, the chief of security ordered the door opened. Stalin was lying on the floor beside his bed, his right arm bent unnaturally. Eyes open, mouth slightly parted. No sign of struggle, just a stillness that unnerved even the doctors when they arrived hours later. But they didn't come to save him. Not really. They had been summoned too late, almost deliberately. Anya remembered the looks on their faces. Cautious, controlled, as if they too feared being accused of killing a man who might still open his eyes. He didn't. In the chaos that followed, no one mentioned the meal. But Anya couldn't forget it. The untouched tray sat in the kitchen, quietly spoiling. She watched it for hours. The meat grayed, the tea cooled, the potatoes shriveled. No one dared throw it out. 3 days later, she slipped into the pantry and did it herself. Quietly. No ceremony, no words. She tipped the tray into the waste bin, washed the dishes with her own hands, and returned them to the shelf as if nothing had ever happened. But something had. She didn't attend the funeral. She wasn't invited. Most of the kitchen staff were dismissed in the weeks that followed, cleansed, as one officer put it, to preserve the security of the new era. She was allowed to return to her village, with a warning never to speak of what she'd seen. She obeyed. For decades. But late in life, in a room filled with paper and silence, she began writing. Not for revenge, not even for justice, just to remember. And in those pages, she returned again and again to that last meal. How something as ordinary as food could carry so much fear, and how a dictator who trusted no one could be brought down not by violence, but by his own loneliness. She wrote, "He didn't die surrounded by enemies. He died surrounded by silence. And that, more than any bullet or betrayal, is what finally killed him." After Stalin's death, nothing felt real. Not the ceremonies, not the portraits draped in black, not the rehearsed eulogies broadcast across the republics, but the silence. That was real. It fell over the country like a sheet of lead. No one cheered, no one cried. People walked slower, spoke less. Even the trees around the dacha seemed to stand more still, as if afraid to move now that the man who ruled them with suspicion was gone. For Anya, the return to civilian life was strange, too normal. She baked bread again. She greeted neighbors. She married a man who never asked about her past. And yet, every evening, as she stirred the soup or dusted the shelves, her mind wandered back to the kitchen of the dacha, to the folded napkins, the bent teaspoon, the untouched tea, and most of all, to that sentence, the one that started it all. She told no one, not even her children, but the fear never fully left her. Whenever a door slammed unexpectedly, she flinched. When someone knocked at night, her hands trembled. Even after Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes, she said nothing, because memory in her world had always been a threat. But age has its own gravity. When she turned 80, she began writing, slowly, cautiously. At first, it was recipes, bread, soups, preserves. Then, tucked between the margins, fragments of the dacha, names, dates, voices she couldn't forget. It wasn't until she was 84 that she wrote about the sentence. Not just what Stalin had said, but what it meant, that fear, once planted, doesn't die with the man who sowed it. It lingers, in policy, in silence, in the way people avoid each other's eyes even decades after the terror ends. Her final pages were the most haunting. She described how every regime that depends on silence eventually becomes hostage to it. How power, once rooted in fear, can never truly rest, because it is always listening for footsteps in the dark. Stalin had built a fortress of isolation, and in the end, he died inside it. Anya passed away quietly in a provincial hospital under a different name. Her journals remained hidden for years until her granddaughter, sorting through old boxes, found them. Some pages were burned, others smeared. But enough survived to tell a story most historians never recorded. And now, it's yours. Because behind the myths of history are lives like hers. Unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. Lives that remind us that the machinery of tyranny doesn't turn without people like Anya. Silent, watchful, afraid, and still alive enough to remember. What she heard that night wasn't just a secret. It was a warning, one we'd be foolish to ignore. History likes to dress its monsters in uniforms and medals. It simplifies them, makes them into symbols, into clear-cut villains that rise and fall on cue. But the truth is quieter, harder to hold. It lives in kitchens, behind service doors, inside folded napkins and untouched meals. It hides in the people no one thinks to ask. Anya Morozova wasn't a revolutionary. She wasn't a dissident or a spy. She was a cook, a girl chosen not for her politics, but for her silence. And that's what makes her story so dangerous. Because regimes like Stalin's don't just run on orders. They run on obedience, on the thousands of small fears that stop people from speaking, from asking, from remembering. Her journals don't expose some lost conspiracy or grand assassination plot. They expose something worse, the everyday machinery of a government that trained its people to fear their own thoughts. And maybe that's why her story matters more now than ever. Because silence is easy, especially when the truth is uncomfortable, especially when remembering comes with a cost. But Anya's voice, quiet as it was, reached across decades, not through speeches or broadcasts, but through paper, through memory, through the courage of someone who was never meant to leave a trace. If you're watching this, then you carry that memory now, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Because history isn't just written by the powerful. It survives because someone stayed alive long enough to tell it. And when the last witness is gone, all that's left is the myth. So ask yourself, what stories are still trapped behind closed doors? What truths are quietly fading, unspoken, because someone is still afraid? Anya didn't think she mattered, but she did, and so do all the others like her. Those who saw too much and said too little, waiting for a moment safe enough to speak. This is that moment. Don't let it disappear. If you want to understand more stories like Anya's, stories of real people who witnessed the darkest moments of history from the inside, then you need to click on this video right here. It goes even deeper. And once you hear what they saw, you won't forget it.